So it's my very great pleasure to welcome to this meeting my opposite number in the USA, whose name is Dr. Don Hillger, and he is a researcher working in the state of Colorado. And I should say that Colorado is 7 hours behind us by the clock. So unfortunately, Don wasn't able to join us for the meeting live because it would have been in the middle of the night for him. But here he is. And just to say a few words about Don, he's a very distinguished individual. Um, his background is actually in meteorology and specifically in atmospheric science. And he's been researching in that field since a long time ago. His PhD was originally in 1983. And he's been working as a research meteorologist, among other things. He's still active in the field. And he's been very, very proactive in the area of metrication in the USA, and we'll learn a bit more about the ups and downs of that over the years. He became the first webmaster for the opposite number, the US Metric Association, back in 1996, and he's been in the forefront of that association ever since. He's been the president of the USMA since 2015, and in that time he's also been the editor of the newsletter, which some of you may already get. Extremely thought-provoking and intelligent piece of publication called Metric Today. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Don, and he'll tell you a bit about himself and his work and the state of metrication in the USA. Don.
Yeah, well, thank you, Peter, for inviting me to speak. And, I might have been tough and tried to join you guys real time, but I don't know how good I am at getting up in the middle of the night and and talking. But thank you very much for this opportunity. And as you said, I'm the president of the Metric Association. It's a relatively small group in the United States. We have on the order of 100 to 200 members, but there's a number of us that are quite active and very interested in seeing the metric system adopted more readily or more widely in the United States. Of course, we always say in the organization that, and probably one of my bottom lines is, probably 50% of the measurements in the United States are metric if you consider all things that are manufactured or brought in, imported, and things like that, and the fields that are metric, like automobiles and farm and equipment machinery like that is metric. But there's so many things that are lacking and things that really disappoint the organization that we haven't been able to complete, kind of like you guys who struggle yet with miles on the roads, and we have miles on our roads, and we have Fahrenheit temperatures, for weather reports. So we're kind of disappointed that we can't seem to get those big picture social metrication things to change. But I can talk to you a little bit about some of the things that have changed, and you might be interested in that. And Peter mentioned the newsletter. We had an editor at one point other than me, but the editor, after doing it a number of years, decided he wanted to quit, and so I've been editor for the newsletter for a long time, and we'll gladly send that to anybody in your organization that wants it free. We charge for a minimal amount for members because we have to have an operating expense, something to spend. But other than that, we're willing to share that. So yeah, well, these slides are really about the status of U.S. metrication, but I'll talk a little bit before we get into this set of slides about the USMA. We have a number of programs that we've been fostering over several years now. We have a scholarship program, which is probably the big one, which is the biggest expense for the organization. We give a scholarship to two students, first and second place winners every year for their education in college, should they decide, not as a college degree, but if they should decide that they want to continue to promote U.S. metrication. One of the questions is asked, what have you done so far as a senior student in high school? And then what do you plan to do in the future? And interesting, we get a lot of applications, usually on the order of 1,000 applications. We could get many more than that, but of course, even going through that number is quite a task. And then we pick a couple winners, and actually we're in the throes right now of picking the winners for the 2025 scholarships, which will be awarded in the fall for a couple students as they go on to their college of choice. And we've had some good students picked in the past who promised to do things and are very interested in metrication. And so this is kind of a way to bring on new people that will actually do something and keep the organization going, is because all of us are getting older, and I can't say we have a lot of younger people joining. They have a lot of other interests. So anyway, we do the scholarships, and we've done the science fair. I don't know if you guys in England have something like the science fair there, I imagine, which are, grade school and high school, upper school students doing science projects, and we give awards there too. Unfortunately, the awards are not monetary. We couldn't afford to do that. There were subscriptions to the newsletter, and but at least we give something away, and we give them a certificate for using metric well in their science fair projects. So and when Metric Week comes around in the fall in the US, we have Metric Week on 10/10, October 10th. And so that's a time when we try to do some additional promotion among teachers, educators. And then we have a couple members too who are very interested in doing outreach. One particular one in Arizona right now contacts schools and does weekend events where he sets up a booth and talks to anybody who's interested in metrication associated with other things that are going on that weekend. It's like sometimes it's a race and sometimes it's a STEM education project or something like that. So we have a number of things as an organization, and we learn as we go, and we've taken on some of these things, and we've kept them going for a number of years because they've turned out to be fairly fruitful as far as gaining a few new people. I can't say we get overrun by new members, but we certainly need to get a few new ones and perpetuate because I think our task is not done. We're probably going to be fighting this battle for a while yet. I don't see the US flipping the switch and going automatically metric here anytime soon, but I see us making progress all the time. Basically, if people don't know the history of US metric in the United States, you can look at some of the points here. I won't speak to them word for word, but basically the metric system's been legal for hundreds of, 150 years or more since 1866. So theoretically, it should be possible for anybody to use metric here and not be penalized for it. But it turns out if you try to do metric in a place where everything else is non-metric, like for example, on your driver's license to get your height in meters or something on your driver's license, many states don't allow that, or they don't allow you to put your weight in kilograms, or we've had the example too of people doing surveys. We actually have a surveyor who is a member of the association, and he runs into the battle all the time. He likes to do his surveys in metric, but when he submits them to the places that save the documents, they say, well, we won't take that. It has to be in feet. And then he points to him and says, well, it's legal in the United States. But then, what is he going to do? Mount a big legal battle and try to bring it through? Some of these things are hard. There's just a lot of internal resistance. So anyway, that's enough about that point about legality, but it technically should be legal for anything we do. That's on the books. And also any of our non-metric measurements that Mendenhall order, the second point there, actually made all of our US units based on metric units. So we don't have a like you have for the kilogram, a mass that's used to be the standard for the kilogram. We don't have a pound mass. It's all defined in terms of the pound is defined in terms of kilogram, and the foot is defined in terms of the meter. So all of our units are so in that sense, we're already on the metric system, but we use these strange combinations. And so that's not, we don't like that kind of a system. We want to be on metric in the basic metric and not just having our units based on metric. So anyway, Congress in the United States has the power to set our weights and measures. And so we really need Congress to act in order to overcome the hurdles that we have. Unfortunately, in the past, we've had some champions in Congress that have helped us, but right now we really don't. And so it's very hard, and the political climate is really not very good for trying to get any kind of metric laws through Congress. And so although that's the path we really need to go, we really can't go there. And so we're trying to work through education, and we're also trying to just promote metric as it's organically taken on in the United States as new products come along and as other products are metricated. So, and a little of that is continuing to go on. And as far as education, the last point there, it's being taught, but I don't think teachers do it well. There's a lot of conversion that's taught, and students, when they go home, they don't have a lot of chance to use metric because there's just, in everyday life, there's just a lot of non-metric that still goes on. This is kind of the point that I made already at the end. In conclusion, about 50% of our measurements in the United States are already metric, but you really wouldn't know that if you ask the common person. They would say, well, we use Fahrenheit and we use miles. Well, yeah, we do that, and those are big things. But if you look behind the scenes, all our automobiles and are designed and built in metric, even though it might have a speedometer that has miles per hour on it, that's switchable, but people don't do that. And because you have road signs that are in miles per hour. So it just doesn't make sense. I mean, you have to have some coordinated plan, and that would really be up to Congress, like I said. And many citizens really don't know the extent of metric use. When I have an opportunity to talk to people, I try to explain to them that no, metric didn't die back in the 70s when we had a metric conversion act that was voluntary. I didn't really make that point so far, that our metric conversion act was totally voluntary. And so that without government promoting it or doing the behind the scenes promotion of it, we really haven't made all the strides we really could, or they never put down a 10-year plan like it was done in many countries, South Africa or New Zealand or Australia, like that, where they did it very nicely and did it in a short period of time. So it is kind of hidden. It's hidden from most people, but I always like to point out a lot of those things. It's so obvious to us that can see it, but it isn't obvious to those that really aren't looking for it. So some of the things that have changed, though, and Peter kind of asked me to address some of these, that up until recently, there was still a lot of use of teaspoons in over-the-counter medications that you can go to what we call drugstores. I don't know if you guys call them chemists or whatever, but you can go and the little things would say, take 2 teaspoons or 1 teaspoon, and it was so ridiculous because although there is a standard for the teaspoon, people don't have measuring teaspoons. They have the many different sizes. And so that has gone away. Some of the medical organizations have helped us promote this. They haven't forced it, but they've made strong recommendations as far as eliminating teaspoons from oral medication. So you see the little thing on the right there, it shows it in milliliters. For example, if you want to take something for your common cold. And then patient weights, the second point there, are increasingly being measured in kilograms, although this is far from universal. If I go to my local doctor, so to speak, and a primary physician, he'll probably measure me in pounds and then report that to me. But if you go to the hospital, they'll almost invariably weigh you in kilograms. They've seen, because they have to do that for drug dosing. My wife's been in the hospital a couple times recently and has had her weight. I've noticed they measure it in kilograms. I mean, I've seen it done, so I know that's what takes place. But of course, the patient isn't even given that number because that's all used for internal purposes. So there's kind of again, a hidden metric. The third point there, grams have long been used on food product labels for a long time, and people sometimes just dismiss this entirely. They don't realize they're using grams of proteins and carbs and fats and sugars and milligrams and micrograms of some things, and it's just obvious. There's some of the things I point out to people that, oh, that's metric. Yeah, we are using metric after all. And then the United States imports a lot of things from China, as you guys probably do too as well. I've noticed when I get some of the products that are shipped to me and you have to put them together, I'll notice that the fasteners are metric sizes, and they even send you a wrench often because they don't expect us Americans to have metric wrenches, although we do. We've had metric wrenches for a long time because automobiles have gone metric. But again, most people don't work on their own automobiles unless you're the weekend mechanic. And so there's been a general drift towards metric in many areas, but certainly far from universal. We want to see more of this going on, but it's slow and steady. What has not changed? These are some disappointing things that we've tried to do in the United States, and part of this was due to legislation that tried to be passed. Road construction, although the signs weren't going to change on the roads, road construction was supposed to be metric in '96. Some of our champions in Congress helped get this through, but then of course there was a lot of resistance from the contracting companies because they in some way they thought this was un-American, or they didn't like it because they still had to deal with maybe standards organizations that didn't want their metric drawings, and I don't know. It was kind of a sad day, but a number of states had started to change, and then they all had to revert. So that was a bad thing, and I don't know that we're going to be able to try that again, because they've seen what happens, and the resistance, how big it is. And then second point, federally funded government buildings were to become metric as well at some point in the late '90s. And that again was kind of nullified by allowing metric to go by the wayside in case of lighting, ceiling lighting, and bricks and masonry. Some of the not contractors, but some of the providers for those kind of things didn't want to change their lighting fixtures, or didn't want to change their bricks and masonry, so they fought hard and got the law changed. And so see how things can go sour on the wayside, and even though we have good intentions. And then maybe the third one there, maybe you remember the Mars Climate Orbiter from 1999 that crashed into the surface because there was a confusion between the contractor and NASA as far as who was using metric. And it's a long story, you can look it up, but NASA, as a result of that, got chastised and was supposed to use metric more, but we really haven't seen that change. They still think they need to cow down to the public and use non-metric units. However, SpaceX, if you've ever watched a SpaceX launch and the graphics that go with it, of course, this is an Elon Musk company, and interestingly, he uses kilometer heights and kilometer per hour speeds on the graphics at the bottom of his launch videos. So if you watch, you can see a big difference between those and the ones that are put out by NASA, even though NASA was the one that was supposed to go metric. Peter kind of asked the question about, with the Trump administration and more America First things going on, there was some little upheaval going on, thinking that maybe even among the press that, oh, well, are we going to get rid of the little metric that we do have? And one of those areas of metric is the signs on I-19. It's an interstate highway between Tucson, Arizona and Nogales, Mexico. There was kind of a prototype that was at the time probably built way back in the '90s, when we thought, or even '80s. I forget the original history, sorry, when that was, the metric signs were put up there, but they have been around for a long time, and there's been a number of attempts to remove those metric signs. But again, inertia prevails. People have these signs and they just don't want to change, just like they don't want to change away from the non-metric signs. So it's kind of interesting. But as far as America First, I don't see Trump going and outlawing metric signs, or Congress does enough of that kind of stuff. I don't think that's anything he's going to delve into. And especially, I think Elon Musk, is a scientist, a engineer, really. I think that's his degree. And he sees the need to use metric in his businesses. SpaceX and Tesla, all of his cars are built to metric. And he has a boring company too that I'm sure uses metric. I've never really looked into it, but I don't think there's a problem here. Just like you guys had a little bit of scare when Brexit came along, that thinking that the United Kingdom was going to revert, but there's quite a bit of talk and a number of discussion points, but I don't think really anything is going to go backwards big time. We've had enough of that on, as I pointed out just previously, we've had enough of the backward things going on even before this. So it's two steps forward, one step back sometimes. One of the big things that happened recently, surveying, I talked briefly earlier about surveying, but most surveying in the United States uses feet. And interestingly, the foot they use is not the international foot in many states, but it's the survey foot. And it's as a result of different definitions or different equivalences to the meter, the US survey foot and the international foot are slightly different, like in the sixth order, sixth decimal point or something like that. And only recently in 2023 was there a decision to finally eliminate this, let me call it a stupidity, where we've been using this survey foot, which was really only used in surveying and nobody else. Otherwise, our normal foot in the United States is the international foot. So this is going to be a little bit of a hurdle. Existing surveys are probably going to continue to use feet, but of course anything new is going to have to change, and so we're no longer allowing the survey to be used in any new applications, but of course getting rid of all the old stuff is probably going to hang around a while. So, but that was an interesting thing, and this was partly spearheaded by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, which is our main science organization in the United States as far as metrology. So yeah, when I mentioned NIST, I suggested to Peter that Elizabeth Benham, who the organization USMA works with quite closely, heads up the small metric program that's actually part of the federal government. And so Elizabeth would be an interesting speaker for a future meeting. The question was about the Fair Packaging and Labeling Act, which in the United States now requires all consumer products to have metric as well as non-metric labels, both. But there are plans to amend this labeling act to allow metric only labels, because we have some products that are in metric quantities, but they still have to have the non-metric quantity on there. And some of these things are quite ridiculous, like a 2-liter bottle of soda, which I'm not showing there, but it has all the pints and quarts and whatever it all is in some ridiculous numbers, where it could just say 2 liters if that's the case, because a 2-liter bottle in the United States and 1-liter bottles and 500 milliliter bottles are quite common as far as water and sodas or soft drinks. And so metric label, even though metric labels are uncommon because they're really outlawed yet, we still have to have both on all products. We'd really like to see the non-metric only labels come along at some point. One of the questions posed to me also as well, wondering whether there were surveys or questionnaires going out about metric. Well, I'm really glad these kind of things don't go out, because when they do, they often ask the wrong questions, and it's really a waste of time. Like, they ask people, they expect them to know metric when they're not really taught it very well or don't use it on an everyday life. So how are you going to expect people to say, well, I want metric, when they don't really understand the advantages of it? So as an organization, one of our things when we speak to people, we not only explain how simple it is, but we explain how much it's already used and how much better we'd be off if we did go metric. And every once in a while we get a convert, and we get somebody come along or come and say, well, why isn't our country using metric? This makes so much more sense. I mean, and then the light comes on, and then we've got a new convert. But not everybody sees that. There's a lot of inertia, and a lot of the older generation just doesn't want to be bothered. So unlike you guys who've had metric education in the United Kingdom for a long time and actually have opportunities to use it more than we do, our metric education has kind of gone on the wayside and has really not done that well. It's really minimal, and it's not supported outside the classroom as it says there. But we're working to change that, a few people at a time. I don't think we're at the tipping point yet, but someday, we're making progress. I always say metric is inevitable, but I'm not sure I'm not gonna hold my breath. I'm not gonna say it'll happen this year or even in 10 years. I think it's gonna take a while yet. And then there were some questions about how the US handles the metric system. NIST, again, the National Institutes of Standards and Technology, special publication 330 is really our SI brochure rewritten. And of course, we're sticklers as far as the RE spellings and ER spellings here. People really aren't going to grab onto those. So I don't think that'll ever happen, even though it probably makes more sense. And then of course we adopted the capital L for leader, and I don't know where that stands in other countries, but that's really the standard for the United States is our special publication based on the SI brochure. And then, of course, the USMA tries to follow that. Maybe some of the things on our website are not up to date. We need to do some, constant updating, and particularly with some of the changes in the SI that happened in the last couple of years. I don't think we have all the latest definitions or the redefinitions that have taken place as far as defining the units now in terms of basic constants, physical constants. So,
I think our members would have lots and lots of questions for you based on that. A fascinating presentation, and thank you for that information. It's interesting seeing the parallels with this country and also the differences. You mentioned the V word as involuntary, which, of course, from the point of view of metrication, is not a good word. We had the experience in the UK back in when the Conservative government came in 1979. At that time, Geoffrey Howe was the Secretary of State in charge, and he was actually a friend. He became subsequently actually our president of the UKMA, but his deputy was a woman called Sally Oppenheim, and she had the bright idea that yes, you could metricate, but make it voluntary. And of course, we had a change of currency back in the 1970s from pounds, shillings, and pence, which I'm old enough to remember, to just what we have now, decimal currency. It made a lot of sense to make that change. But imagine somebody had said, well, we want to have the option of transacting in pounds, shillings, and pence if we want to, and we'll do decimal currency if we want to. Nobody would have done that. So exactly the same problem. Voluntary was a kiss of death. And equally, there were businesses who pushed in the opposite direction, famously carpets and so on, where it was actually more interesting for businesses to sell by the yard but than by the meter. And so metrication went into reverse in that area. So there are parallels there, like you and the building industry. It's interesting when somebody, I think an older person, was asked about changing to changing currency, the response came back, well, couldn't they just have waited until all the old people had died off?
Yeah,
that's the
when
kind
does
of
that
thinking.
happen?
Yes, sometime, but not just now. Thanks very much. So arising from that, a couple of questions. You mentioned about education and the fact that schools don't really teach metric. In this country, as you know, it's been since the 1970s. It's been a primary unit taught. And it doesn't take as much learning by any manner of means as the old units. But do people actually understand the relationship between, within the non-metric system? So, for example, in this country, a lot of people who give their weight in, stones and pounds. We have this thing called stones in England, which I know in America would be a bit alien. But most people who use that don't actually know how many pounds there are in a stone.
Yeah.
And even less could they tell you how many yards there are in a mile and so on. Whereas in metric, of course, that's entirely intuitive. Would you say the same thing applies in America?
Oh yeah, yards is not other than in football, it's not a very common unit. So people don't readily know the number of yards in a mile. I wonder if everybody even knows the number of feet in a mile, the 5,280. I don't, it's such a klutzy number, and I often point that out to people and how ridiculous is this? Why can't we pick something that makes more sense, And so it's actually something to our advantage, that these things are so stupid. But I think really a lot of people don't understand unit system that they do use. And if you question them, they really wouldn't be able to support it or understand why why the inches the way it is, or the defined in terms of, where it came from, or there just isn't a lot taught about measurements in the schools. And although people pick up measurements from home, you learn to measure things, and you teach it. And like I said earlier, you teach them a little bit about metric. Well, here's the metric system, but you're probably never going to use it unless you go into science or something like that. And then when they get to the chemistry class, oh yeah, they taught me metric way back in grade school, and I'll have to bring that back up because I've never used it between now and then, and so so often science classes have to spend a lot of time teaching metric so that the students can use it because they just are not familiar with it. But then once students get into the sciences, then they're really engulfed in metric. And then
Yeah.
that's where a lot of our proponents of the metric system in the United States come in. I was a physics major. I have a physics degree as well as meteorology. And so I thought, well, this just makes sense. It works right with the equations of physics, and there's none of these crazy conversion factors. And I thought, well, then why don't we just change in this country? And then I realized how big of an issue it was. And so, but I was glad to see other countries change, and I'm glad to see England as far along as it is, even though we share a common problem with the fact that we just can't clean up the last part of the mess,
Yeah,
So,
well, I mean, our official exemptions are the yard, foot, and pint,
yeah.
and they still exist. And I mean, supermarkets, of course, in the UK are largely, if not entirely, metric. We have the anomaly that if you buy beer on draft, it's measured in pints. But generally speaking, if you buy it in cans, it's metric. And equally, doorstep milk comes in pint bottles, but supermarket milk is measured
Yeah,
in liters. Um,
yeah.
and I mean, what would interest me would be, I suppose, how many people actually know that the gold standard for all of your units of measurement is actually a metric one.
No, I don't think they do. That's one of the things I point out when I speak to them. I say, show me the standard for your foot or something. And they, you know, they're just kind of starry-eyed because they don't know where it came from, and they don't realize anymore it's defined in terms of the metric system. And so that floors a lot of people, or puts them back. And then they
Yeah,
don't realize they've been on the metric system all this time. They kind of, it's almost like, oh, we want to be American. We want to go back to our foot, and we want to go back to our pound. And well, what foot, what pound? It's not been there for, 150 years. So, so
and this word un-American is striking. I mean,
yeah,
it's a sort of supposition that these units are American in origin. I mean,
yeah.
I'd like to ask you a question about how it comes about that the units used in the USA are different from the imperial units used in Britain. Um,
Yeah, I don't have a real good handle on that, but my understanding is that the US adopted the English measurements at the time that kind of we broke away from, 250 years ago now. And then I think the British imperial system was actually developed after that
yeah,
point. And so
1854.
then that's where so we really shouldn't call our units imperial, because we adopted the British
Yeah,
units, or whatever they were called before being imperial units. And so a lot of people think that we're using imperial units, but we don't, because our gallon is different than the imperial gallon, and whatever, that's the big one anyway. But and then the pint, of course, yeah.
well,
And
it's
talking
and
volume mainly, so yeah, the
of
mile
course
is
the
the same.
ton, the
Yeah,
2,000 pound ton is
yeah,
something you
yeah.
wouldn't
There you go, the
understand.
ton. Yeah.
Yeah. But I mean, it's interesting. I can say with the feeling, because the first time I went into a pub and ordered a pint in America, I got this very small glass, and I thought it was strange.
Yeah, yeah,
So not only is an American pint 16 fluid ounces as compared to 20 fluid ounces in the UK,
yeah,
but the
yeah,
American fluid ounce is 0.04 bigger.
yeah,
It's 1.04 British fluid ounces. So
yeah.
there isn't even a direct easy comparison between the two. And they're called customer units, I think, as opposed to imperial units. I mean,
Yeah,
the
that's
background to
that's
that.
kind of our preferred name. We've had some other names for our kind of joking names for our unit system, but we won't go into that. And then people don't also know that gold is measured in troy ounces versus
Yeah,
avoirdupois ounces for everything else, and people don't realize that. And then why is an ounce used for a volume when it's really a mass? And and things, fluid ounces, we have fluid
yeah.
ounces, and then we have regular ounces. And so, you know, it's like you said, Peter, people really don't understand our unit system. If you start to really quiz them about these things, they're really not very educated about it. I mean,
Nobody knows what a stone is, for example,
yeah.
which
Well,
people
yeah, in the United
often
States,
do.
we've heard of that units, and I think some of us know from running into it enough what it is, but nobody uses that here. So
And much less rods and perches and poles and furlongs and so on.
yeah,
I mean,
yeah,
it's a complete alphabet soup of different words.
yeah,
My
yeah,
theory is that one of the reasons why the old units have remained popular is because they're mostly one syllable. Um, I mean, as I say,
yeah,
furlong being an honorable exception, but when you talk about uh, you know, ton, pound, ounce, inch, foot, yard, and so on. Whereas by definition, metric units tend not to be monosyllabic.
right, right. No,
And
that is kind of a disadvantage, and that's because that's how micron came about, because people don't like to say micrometer,
yeah,
they like to say and I run into that a lot, even in the sciences. We use spectroscopy, and people use microns all the time, and then of course the astronomers use angstroms all the time, and uh, things like that. So even among the science fields, and I got to say, being a scientist, I'm disappointed by a lot of my fellow scientists that they really haven't jumped on the bandwagon as far as promoting the metric system. They feel they have to convert things when they talk to the public. Okay, we'll do it all in metric, but then when we get to the public, we're going to have to change it to Fahrenheit.
yeah,
I mean, all the meteorology is really done in metric behind the scenes, all the models and stuff. I mean, even though we have Fahrenheit, it's just a veneer that's on the end there.
no,
And even Celsius is used on all the automated weather stations in the United States anymore.
yeah.
They all measure in Celsius, but then so you'll notice when they give the temperatures for those weather stations, it's often, you can tell it never hits certain Fahrenheit values because it's always in a unit Celsius. So,
And I mean, odd enough, as you pointed out yourself on one
yeah,
occasion, the temperature is quite exceptional. If you say, for example, 2 tons is twice as big as 1 ton, that's obviously true. But if you
yeah,
go from 1 degree Fahrenheit to 2 degrees Fahrenheit, you're not
yeah,
doubling the temperature.
yeah, right.
That would only ever apply if you were using degrees Kelvin. Um,
Yeah, people don't understand absolute zero, and sometimes they get confused as far as something being twice as warm. It's twice as warm this year as last year or something.
quite
Yeah,
interesting, isn't it? So,
yeah.
I mean, we could talk forever, but one thing I wanted to ask you about is what does it feel like being in a metric sandwich? But by which I
Oh,
mean that you've got south of you Mexico, which is pretty much entirely metric, and Canada, which is sort of heading that way, and at least all the road signs are in kilometers, and many other things are done in metric, whereas in the States it's different.
well, that's a real advantage for us because if people, I don't see as many people traveling to Mexico other than maybe flying down to the resorts. A lot of people don't cross the borders because the southern border is kind of a dangerous place often. But many people go to Canada and then they are introduced to the metric system up there. And because it's used on roads and used in weather reports, or if people travel to Europe or England, then they run into these things. So these are advantages for us, uh, but on the other hand, it's probably a disadvantage for those countries because everybody coming in there probably complains about they don't understand what your units are because we're American.
It's a bit like actually the situation here because the nearest neighbour UK has is where I come from, the Republic of Ireland, which is metric on the roads anyway. And you cross the Irish border. The only way you can tell that you've crossed it is that suddenly the road signs are in kilometers on the south
Yeah, yeah,
and miles
yeah,
on the north.
yeah.
So it's certainly an analogy.
Well, that was a nice change. I was glad to see that happen. When was that? About
In the
10,
70s.
15 years ago or so? Yeah.
Oh no, the 70s. I remember, I mean, I lived in Ireland
Oh,
until 1982, and they had completed the metrication of distance signs. The speeds took a bit
oh,
longer,
yeah.
and that may be partly because people could use this as an excuse in court that they misread the signs and they thought
Mhm.
it meant 100 miles an hour.
Yeah.
And is that plausible? Well, I don't know. Yeah, so intriguing. I mean, just by way of winding up, just to ask you, looking back over the history of the USMA, which goes back many years, I think it considerably antedates our association. But what have been the highlights? What have been sort of major achievements over the years, do you think?
Well, the organization goes back to 1916, and there have been a number of battles over the metric system in our legislation. And I don't know all that history. It's been written up very nicely in some of the documents that are available from the National Institute of Standards and Technology. They have a set of documents that explain the whole metric history before I came along in the 80s. But losing my train of thought here. Ask me your question again, Peter. Sorry.
What's been the main achievement, do you think? The
Oh,
one thing you've
oh
done?
yeah. Sorry. Well, I mean, we have just passing a metric conversion act. The big one I pointed out was making metric legal in the United States.
Yeah,
That was a big one from 1866. And then actually, even though the Metric Conversion Act from 1975 was voluntary, it did allow a number of countries or companies to change to metric. Automobiles, pharmaceuticals, they saw no barrier anymore, that they weren't forced to. Well, they look at the 1866 law, but also the Metric Conversion Act allowed them to change, but it probably allowed a lot of people not change too. So, we got to take what we got. We wish it didn't say voluntary. We wish it had a time frame
yeah,
associated with it. But even if it did, I think we'd always have some resistance. The government in the United States doesn't have total control over what people do, and in some way that's nice. I'm not a hard-handed government person on the one hand, but I almost wish in the case of metric that we did force people to do more as far as metric by having the government do everything that it did in metric, and then that would be a big impetus. But instead, the government doesn't even help us out. So
supplementary on that question, because you did hint earlier that different states have different rules about driving licenses and so on.
yeah.
How much discretion do states have to legislate on weights and measures? And is it a good thing or a bad thing that they have influence?
Well, again, I think the weights and measures in the United States are statewide. I mean, it's Congress's purview in the Constitution to set the weights and measures. So I think it really you wouldn't need every state to do it, but the states generally follow what the government suggests, and you'd have to have the government decide to change its mind, and then the states would follow suit. I think maybe some would probably put up some resistance for a while, just like certain states are politically more conservative than others, but I wouldn't blame it exactly on all the conservative states. I think, a lot of the conservative states are very business oriented, and I think they want to see their businesses grow and use the metric system. They're not going to ban it for that reason,
Yeah.
because a lot of the things that are pharmaceuticals, automobiles, machinery, farm machinery, even is all metric, yet the farmer still doesn't use it when he goes out in his field. So.
And just, I suppose, concluding question, which I mean, I think I know the answer to what your long-term dream would be, which is to be where many other countries in the world are in terms of use of single metric units. But looking at the rest of your tenure as president, what would be your achievable goals, do you think?
Well, as much as I'd like to see the trip the big elephant and have something change, I don't see that happening. I think I'm gonna work as much as I can to not only perpetuate the organization, because I think without USMA, I think there would be less having been done as far as metric in the United States. I think we're a cadre of people that have really helped push this thing along. And back in the 70s, when we thought we were going to go metric, the organization was huge. We had thousands of members, and we had a lot of people really interested in helping us, and there was a lot done. And I think those people were very instrumental in many of the things that did change. And we can't necessarily say USMA was exactly the cause of all those things, but the cause was a lot of people that worked on those projects, and they were also members of the organization. So even though the organization can't be given total credit, it's the people, and I hope to grow the organization. So through the scholarships and through the science fair things, that we always have a bunch of people that are interested in keeping this moving along, because if we don't have that, I think just relying on Congress to do things on its own is never going to happen. So.
Fantastic. Well, I think you've answered the questions extremely well, and it's been a fascinating discussion. I'm really intrigued by what you had to say. And it just remains for me to say to our members that maybe some of you will have questions, and we can then forward them on to you for further consideration. I hope that's okay with you.
Oh yeah, no, please have them contact me. And again, I say our newsletter is free for any of your members. And I also want to again invite, if a bunch of you guys want to come over to United States at some point, we'll all meet somewhere and we'll talk about metric. So
Well, so Dr. Don Hillger, thank you very much
yeah.
indeed for your time.
Okay, Peter, take care. Bye-bye.